Hello, everybody. I think we just caught Mark picking his nose as we start the class on YouTube. And I think that was the first thing that popped up on the screen.
I was scratching my nose with my thumb.
Mark. So we are starting the series, session 1 of the residential purchase agreement. Hello, everybody. I think we just caught Mark picking his nose as we start the class on YouTube.
Yeah, you got a time delay there. You might have to edit that out of the video.
Well, I went and muted that. I keep forgetting I have to mute that. But anyway, so welcome. We're going to get going on this. I'm going to get right into it. We're going to cover the purchase agreement, best practices, opening documents. We got your broker Bob here today and our fantastic compliance officer, Mr. Mark Miller, direct and live from Arizona with his personal assistant, Gracie. So I've gone in and set stuff up already, sort of, but I'm going to walk some people through it.
Did you create a new transaction, Bob?
I sure did, Mark.
Great, cool.
I learned the last time, if you don't create the transaction, you might be in trouble because there's new documents every week from CAR. Shocker.
Yeah.
And let me get the chat bar up. So we do have the chat bar up. Mark is monitoring that. So am I. We will answer questions as best we can as we are also presenting. So I've gone through and have set up a new transaction in zip forms, and I've pre-selected a listing that we're going to make a purchase on. So when you go into your dashboard and you will click on new transaction, you'll see where my cursor is right up there into transactions. You'll have a selections where you hit a house, create new transaction. It'll be a residential purchase and ask a few other questions. And then there's a great device with zip forms that connects to its Zip Form Connect or MLS Connect. Basically, all you need to do when you get to this part is put in the MLS number that you're going to make the offer on. And click the MLS Connect. And it's not in CLAW, is it SDSPN, Mark?
I thought it was CRMLS, but it looks like it erased your MLS number there.
Let's try that. And I always like to include the property photo to make sure I brought the right one in. And that's not the one that I wanted. That's the one I wanted.
Oh.
So we're going to import that. I can't even read my own writing. Do I want to replace the existing data? Yes. And then there what I've done is I've brought in all the information on the property, the address, the unit number, city, county, state, zip code, subdivision, year built, assessor parcel number, listing summary, in other words, the listing price, the HOA dues, and then you'll see the rest of this information down here is blank. But when we go through the rest of the documents, you'll see some of the stuff that was imported. So
let me
on this right here, because I don't do this enough, but it's got the unit number 1 and the street address and the unit number 1 here. Is there anything that you should note to remove one of those?
It's important. I'm glad you brought it up because it's an important point that the zip form programming will not pick up the unit number from the unit number field and put it into your forms. So if you just in street address didn't have the unit number would not appear on your forms. So you can have it in both fields. It doesn't hurt anything to leave it in unit number field, but definitely add it in the street address field, or otherwise you will not see it on your forms, and you'll probably get a counter offer back that says, the unit number is, whatever.
And that does happen occasionally.
Yeah, it happens a lot, and it's just the way zip forms programming works. It picks up everything in the street address field and puts it into the form, but it doesn't pick up the unit number.
Okay, so I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to go over to the Documents tab right here. And then most of the documents that would be sort of required to be in the transaction will auto populate into here. And usually the first sheet that I want to go to when I'm crafting an offer is go into the cover sheet, because the cover sheet is it's basically your cover sheet of the entire transaction document. It includes the buyer's names, the seller's names, the property information that was imported from the MLS Connect, the escrow information, the buyer's broker information, which will be you once we fill this out, the seller's broker information. You'll see the great thing is MLS Connect imported all the information needed on the seller's broker information. So when you are on page 10 of the in the section on the CBC, cooperating broker compensation, it'll auto populate that, and you need that to make sure you get paid. You'll be able to add the lender information, the appraisal information, the title information, pest control, disclosure information. This will auto populate once we add a disclosure company. Home warranty, once we add a home warranty. So every one of these documents, once we fill out some of this, it will auto-populate across all fields within every document that's necessary. And then the homeowner's information that came from the MLS, if it doesn't have all the information, it's only going to bring over what was input in the MLS. So why do you want to make sure your cover sheet is up to date? Well, your cover sheet basically is a record of every person that will be involved in this transaction, from the co-op agents, the buyers, the sellers, the escrow, the title, the home warranty. And so think of it as a record-keeping document for you to give to your transaction coordinator that will help make their job easier. So when you open up a transaction, you just make sure your cover sheet is filled out completely, and you can provide this information over to your transaction coordinator so that they have all the information they need, and they're not hunting you down for all that information to get back to them. So good point to fill out the cover sheet, and then when you're filling this out, when you start using DocuSign, you'll want to make sure these boxes are checked for the buyer, because it will automatically appear an X on where the buyers are going to need to sign in the transaction. So in the cover sheet, we're going to start entering the buyer name. Billy Bob's the buyer. And the street address is not the address of the property. It's the address that the buyer currently lives at. So I'm just going to come up with an old address. This actually was a house that I had. And then I'm going to enter in my emails. So also a good point here is to make sure you put the buyer's email address in, because when you start sending stuff out for digital signature, it's going to need an email address for that buyer. So this time I'd like Mark to address a buyer or buyers utilizing one email address.
Well, you put me on the spot, huh?
And why you don't want to do that.
It's not a good idea because it really doesn't while technically it's possible, it really doesn't distinguish between the two people that are signing if they're both using the same email address. So it's best for, if you have two buyers or more than two buyers, that they each have their own unique email address. And the way, you know, the digital signature process works is you define who signs first, who signs second, who signs third, and so forth. And so when buyer one completes the signature, it goes to buyer number two. And if it just went to the same email, well, then, you know, the physical person number two would have to know that they had now to sit down and sign it. It's really not a good idea to use the same email for different buyers that are signing uniquely. So always try and obtain a unique email for each party in the transaction.
And we've had transactions where it screwed up the transaction coordinator it just made it a mess with once they start signing documents. So at all costs, good advisement to have a separate email address for each principal on a transaction. And then, you know, these forms contain antiquated information like a home phone. Who really has that anymore except maybe Mark's grandma? And a business phone. And then a fax number. I don't know anybody that has a fax number anymore, but 1990 called and they want their fax machine back. Now, the second piece of information is not brought in. I thought that auto-loaded into this, Mark.
Well, we really don't know who that is yet because the information imported from the MLS doesn't have the actual seller's name. That is.
I thought it brought in the stuff from CRS. Okay.
You mean from public record? Yeah, well,
yeah.
It might. Yeah.
I thought it did, but anyway, at this point, let's say we went and found the public records on the MLS listing, and then we're just going to enter the seller in this for now. And it's only one seller on this. And then the property information, the MLS number, you're just verifying again, hey, is this the address that we are making the offer on? There have been some times in the past, not so much today, because everything's so digital, but where people would transpose a street address. And so then they made an offer on the wrong property. But you're just kind of making sure, and you definitely need the assessor's parcel number in there. And then the listing date, that's not so important.
I've seen a couple of contracts lately where that APN number said to be determined at escrow or provided at escrow. Don't do that. You know, find the APN number and define it in the contract. You know, that is a further assurance that you're talking about a specific property.
Oh my gosh. And then property type, I'll check residential. I'm not going to fill out any terms in here because we're going to go through that and show you how to do that. And then escrow information, once we show it in the contract, it will all auto-populate here. But it would be a good opportunity here to enter your lender's name and company that the buyer is working with. Because again, think of this as a sheet you're going to give your transaction coordinator or maybe anybody else in the transaction, like even escrow. They're going to need to know who the lender is. And it'd be important for them to have that right now. And then title will auto-populate. You won't pick pest control yet. And disclosure, home warranty, and HOA. Okay, so we're going to save that. We're going to go back to the rest of the contract documents, and what we're going to do, let's talk about opening.
You actually have a listing transaction.
What's that?
I said you actually have a listing transaction.
You know what? I knew this was going to happen. When I was creating the transaction, Zip Forms wasn't loading the entire page, so I was clicking on something that I was guessing was the right place.
Oh, that's okay. Just go back to we'll click on transactions, or actually just click on new. We'll just start one, or unless you have one that you made already.
Well, I've got Johnny Buyer right here for the BRE.
Is that a recent
It was
created?
May 12th.
Yeah, May 12th. So it doesn't have all the new stuff in it.
Okay,
Well, yeah. New purchase.
See, this wasn't doing it. It wouldn't show what these were below. It didn't even
Really?
show. Okay, so I've already messed up this class.
Residential. Well, I put in the property address, or if you're, here's an interesting point, everyone. If you're working with a buyer and you don't have a property identified yet, then you put in the buyer's name, Billy Bob Buyer, or Billy Buyer, whatever it is. And then once you have a property identified and an accepted offer, then you can change the name of the transaction to that property address.
So we're going to try it one more time.
You might have to change that to CRMLS at the top there. There you go. So the global templates automatically applied when you click on save. It doesn't actually, you don't actually have to apply any templates in ZipForm Broker Edition. It happens automatically for you. So now, since Robert's already filled out the cover sheet and that other transaction, you know how to do that. But let's just go to the form, Robert, because it will, the way the programming works is that if you enter the data in the if you enter the data in the form, it'll appear in the cover sheet, and if you enter the information in the cover sheet, it'll appear in the form. So you can use it either way. Complete the cover sheet or complete the forms and complete the cover sheet in the process. It just depends on how you like to work.
That's why I wasn't bringing in the buyer broker information. I'm like, that's odd. Because that's a listing template.
Using your KW email there, did you want to do that, or the Gmail?
Yeah, no, I wanted
all right.
KW email.
Okay.
And then I can put okay.
Okay, so just save that and then go back to, unless you had something else you wanted to talk about on this one.
That's not the right street address. So we're going to go back and do the MLS Connect again. 200027559.
And then pick CR MLS at the top. It was the same image that you had previously, so I thought
it is bring in the right address. There we go.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
So import. This is the frustration you guys will get with agents in tech and zip forms and SDMLS. And at this point, you might want to just pick up your computer and throw it against the wall and get mad like I do. So let's see if the address, there we go. Now the right address came in. Okay. So let's talk about opening documents you need for every purchase. one of the things you need for an opening document for a purchase, and you're going to need to make this when you're consulting with a buyer, is the estimated buyer cost. Now, the estimated buyer cost is an estimate of what it's going to take for a buyer to purchase that property. So when you're doing your buyer consultation presentation with people, you really need to go through and with their lender get an estimate of what their costs are to bring all the money into the transaction to close. The reason why this is important, because this happens a lot. So this is the estimated buyer cost right here. You can do it here, or you can get it from a lender. If you're working with a buyer that is, you know, pretty much, and very few buyers have 20% down with lots of cash and reserves. And so you get a buyer, and let's say they're doing an FHA loan, and they say, oh no, I'm doing an FHA loan, I have 3.5%, we're good. Okay, great. But what they fail to forget is that there's closing costs. There might be appraisal costs if they have to be charged for the appraisal. There's costs to do a property inspection. So what's important is for them to understand what it's going to cost them and all the money they need to bring into the transaction. So they have a clear-cut idea once they enter escrow, how much money they are going to need within the next 30 days before they close on that escrow. So it's a good idea to make sure you review the estimated buyer cost so that there's no red flags or no buyers freaking out in the last moment that they realize, oh, I got to bring in another $5,000 for closing costs. We don't have that. And at the last minute, you're scrambling to figure out how they're going to bring in the rest of the money. Mark, what else is on for a buyer?
Well, the other thing that you want to make sure that you include, and we'll get to it when we look at the form, is in section 6. It includes the KW SDM, that's Keller Williams San Diego Metro affiliated business arrangement disclosure, and that's up a little bit in the list here, right there, that one. And that's a PDF form. It's not a zip form template, which is why it has the red stroke across the bottom right corner versus the blue. It does not have, signature fields embedded into it, so you need to place the signatures manually when you create your digital signature envelope, which we'll get to in a little bit as well. But this is an important disclosure to include in the along with the offer, because RESPA rules require that we disclose the relationship between our brokerage and our affiliated business, A+ Escrow, even if that service is not being used in the transaction. It's just a required disclosure to advise the parties of the relationship. So I have had some agents tell me, when I ask them, why don't you have that in there? They say, well, it's because we're not using that service. And I go, well, that's not the point. It's preloaded into the RPA contract so that we make the disclosure. It doesn't matter if you're using the service or not. The other one to include that's also marked in RPA section 6 is the market conditions advisory. And that is a zip form template. You'll see that down a little bit further on the list. And right there, I just saw it, market conditions advisory. And that particular form, if you think about advising a prospective buyer of a home about market conditions, when would you want to do that? Would you want to tell them about the possible fluctuations in the market before they sign the contract or after they sign the contract? It makes a lot more sense logically to tell them about it beforehand. If you give it to them afterwards, it really serves no purpose, because they're already contractually committed because they've signed the contract. So that's why we have a couple of these items preloaded into our offers so that they do get included when the offer is sent to the buyer for signature.
And then the other thing you'll need to have the buyer sign would be a CMA. You're going to do a CMA on the property of what you determine of the value of the property.
Right.
So they have an idea.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there, Robert. We talked about that in a previous class about how you could use Realtor Property Resource, which is a NAR benefit, RPR, in order to create that report if you want to.
So you got the estimated buyer proceeds, the CMA, and the
NCA and the ABAD.
Okay. Now we're going to go into the purchase agreement and start writing. So I'm just going to search for it. Is that good for everybody? Can you all see? Just raise your hand.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the first part of the purchase agreement obviously is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. We covered this in the BRE class. I'm not going to go through agency again, but this will be automatically loaded. But hopefully you've already had the buyer sign an agency disclosure. You can have them sign this again. It's the buyer's brokerage firm to buyer, the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. I won't be going through it because we've already discussed this. If you want to see that, go back and look at the earlier class on the BRE that's uploaded to YouTube. Same thing with the PRBS. Same thing, we discussed that there. So we will be going, and then the wire fraud, I will touch on this again because this is important that you do have this conversation with a buyer, because most wire fraud happens on the buy side. And you make sure that you have the conversation about wire fraud being on the rise, that now that they're going to be doing some transfer of funds electronically, they need to follow certain steps to make sure that when they do transfer those funds, they go to the right escrow company. So following these guidelines and having that conversation, again, you're always reminding them. Now here we enter the purchase agreement. So we're going to start filling that out. We're doing it on today's date. I'm verifying the address again. City, state, zip that was auto imported from the MLS. And I believe it was $1,050,000. So for shits and giggles, we're going to offer $1 million. Okay. And then you can see automatically when I put the numbers in there, it auto-populated into that field right there. And then close of escrow. Well, the standard close of escrow is typically on a 30-day cycle. Now, depending on what offer you're writing, you know, the elements of the offer, every transaction is different. Everybody has different timelines. Most transactions are 30 days. However, if you are doing a transaction that has less than 30 days, let's say it has 20 days, and that does happen occasionally, you have to keep in mind that if you're shortening the escrow periods, you will need to shorten every other period that we go through today, that we get through today, in order to accommodate that shortened escrow period. So keep that in mind.
Another important thing to remember too is on this section 1D, a lot of times agents will put 30 days after acceptance. They'll use that second checkbox, but we'd rather have you choose the first checkbox, shall occur on, and then pick a date. And the reason that you want to do that is so that your close of escrow date that you're proposing doesn't land on a Friday, doesn't land on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, doesn't land on the day before a holiday or a holiday. So you're planning a little bit ahead, you know, by saying, okay, well, we want 30 days, but the 30th day happens to fall on a Sunday. So let's make it the following Monday or the prior Friday. That's the strategy behind doing that, so that you avoid those bad escrow days. You know, the day before a holiday is a bad day for an escrow company for you to select as a as a date at close. So try to strategize on your date and choose the first checkbox shall occur on and pick a specific date.
So if you look at this date, today's the 14th. Let's say you submit the offer and you get a fully executed contract on the 16th. So if we go with what Mark was saying, so we look at July 16th, well, 30 days from now, August 16th falls on a Sunday. So if you were to put 30 days after fully executed, after agreement, then it would fall on a Sunday. So what Mark is saying is, and I always recommend, you always want to close on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You never really want to close on a Friday. Friday is a horrific day to close. And typically what happens if it's, let's say it's prior to a holiday weekend, a 3-day weekend, there's a lot of recordings going on and everybody's scrambling to get that recording in. And so sometimes you could have last minute escrow issues that doesn't cause it to close. So if we look at that date, the 16th, if we get the contract fully executed on the 16th, you might want to consider moving the close of escrow to the 18th, which would make it almost about a 32-day escrow. Or if you think the lender can get everything done within 27 days, you might want to consider moving it to the 12th and the 13th, provided everybody is on the same page. And you need to check with the buyer's lender to make sure that they can accommodate anything less than a 30-day. Never go by the words of the buyer. You have a frank conversation with the lender or the loan officer or whoever they're dealing with, and you ask them, can you close less than 30 days? And here's another note on closing. You always need to have a conversation with the buyer that the expectation, let's say you have the agreed upon close date of Thursday the 13th, okay? So if you look at Thursday the 13th, well, in a buyer's normal thought process is great, we'll close on the 13th and move in on the 15th. And then all of a sudden something happens. There's a cloud on title, lender has last minute restrictions, there's an issue with getting the escrow to close because the seller hasn't completed repairs, whatever there is. And more often than not, a good 60 to 70% of the time, there are escrow delays. And there were even more delays during COVID. So if you have a buyer that's expecting to close on the 13th and they think on the 15th they can move in, they're probably in a rental property. They probably have given notice and they think, oh, good, we're going to move out on the 15th and the 16th and be in our new house and clean up the rental property we're in. No bueno. You need to have a frank conversation with them about a 2-week time frame. A 2-week time frame to close escrow before they even think of moving in. And that's a hard conversation to have, but it's trust me, the more escrows you do and the more padding you have with the difference between moving in and closing and moving in, you're going to sleep a lot better at night. And so are your buyers if they have expectations in advance rather than finding out at the last minute, oh my God, we're not going to close escrow on the 15th. We can't move in, but we have to move out of our place. What do we do? They've got movers scheduled. They are prepared to move in. And it creates so much stress and drama on you. And moving is bad enough, but the stress and drama of a late escrow is the #1 thing that frazzles real estate agents during a close. Especially if you have out-of-town buyers that are moving down and they have this expectation to move in on a certain date and they are driving down the Interstate 5 with the U-Haul, with the car attached, and they're all ready to move in on that Saturday. And then they get there and there's no escrow closed and they are sitting there in a U-Haul truck over the weekend, shacked up in some cheap hotel off the interstate, and they're not happy. They're hating you. They're hating the process. They're tired. They're exhausted. They've been moving. They've been packing. And it's a real mess. So please, guys, please, please, please take my advice on this. A 2-week window minimum for a buyer from the date they close to the date they expect to move in. Now, if they don't want to listen to your advice, that's on them and it's not on you, but it's your expectations for them that they know in advance that this is all the years you've sold houses. You tell all your buyers to have a 2-week window. I can't stress this enough because I can't tell you how many agents I have walked off a ledge and had them crying in my office because the buyers are mad at them and they're stressed out because the buyers can't move into their new house. Any questions on that, guys? Can I get a thumbs up that you heard what I said, please? Thank you.
There's
Great.
another couple of strategies in picking a date too, which, keep this in mind. Your buyer's loan, if it has a rate lock on it and the rate lock is going to expire on a certain day, that could be a factor in choosing a date. And another one could be if you go into a new month, then there's additional charges for prepaid taxes and other costs of sale that could change. So consider all those things when you're picking a close of escrow date. And I think the other important thing is to have a discussion with the seller, with the listing agent, and find out what the seller's situation is too. They may need to wait until a certain date to close, and you just by communicating with the listing agent, that's your best way to find a date that works for everyone.
Next section is the confirmation of agency relationship on the purchase agreement. And Kurt Meyer is the broker for this listing, and it auto-populated his MLS number. So this is what's missed occasionally, but you need to make sure that these boxes are checked. Kurt Meyer is representing is the broker for the seller, and the seller's agent is Kurt Meyer. So traditionally, this would be up in here would be the name of the brokerage, but he's a solo broker. So it's his name basically. So he's everything, broker and company name. But you might see you'll see Keller Williams or Remax or C21 in here in some cases. And then the buyer's broker, which is us, you'll check the buyer box, and then you'll put in the your name because it won't auto-populate that. And then your DRE number and our DRE numbers. Mark, what's the percentage of time this is not filled out properly?
Oh, maybe about 40% of the time.
Really? Yeah, so if you don't fill this out properly, you have to do an addendum to correct it and look foolish in front of your principals. So just get this part right here the first time around and you'll be good to go. And on another note, if you do this right, the listing agent on the other side will say, oh my God, this agent filled out everything properly. I don't have to clean everything up in a counteroffer. And so that's going to make your offer bode well, and they're going to look at entertaining your offer a lot more than other offers.
It might even eliminate a need for a counteroffer.
Yeah. Oh, here's another thing on buyers I didn't cover at the very initial. When you're crafting the offer, the elements of the offer includes what the seller's motivation is. So a good practice would be to have a conversation with the listing agent, provided they are talking to you and they're a good listing agent, is reach out to them and have a phone call and say, what is the seller's motivation and what kind of offer can I make to write that would put me in the running to get this property? A lot of it is building that relationship with that listing agent in advance to show who you are, show you're a quality agent, that you're in tune with what the seller wants, and you want to write an offer that's going to be the easiest offer for them to counter, especially in this inventory challenged market. it's a good idea to really have that really good foundation built with that listing agent in advance. To say, hey, what kind of offer can I write that your seller would respond to and that we can be in a good running? And they'll pretty much direct you. The worst thing is to write an offer and just send it blind and not even have a phone call. You know, you got to have a conversation with the listing agent. If anything, call them and let them know you're sending over an offer. Never call them and say you're sending over an offer and then before you even got the offer written, because let's say the buyer decided not to, and then you've got a listing agent that said, well, you were sending over an offer, where is it? And you're not sending it. So remember, this business is built on relationships, and you're building relationships with the other agents as well as in the industry. So the property was $1 million, the initial deposit, which is the earnest money deposit. Depends on the price of the property and how serious the seller is and how serious you want the buyer to look in the eyes of the seller. So when you're crafting the offer for an initial deposit, typically it's between 1% and 3%. So 1% to 3% of the purchase price. In this case, anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000. You have to take into consideration is how many other people are riding on this property. So if you're representing a buyer and the buyer is competing against 15 other offers, well, you want to make that offer stand out. The elements of the offer are important, but what's also important in the eyes of a seller is how serious that buyer is. And to me, as a seller, I'm looking at a buyer that is really serious because they're willing to put skin in the game and put a deposit down that says, hey, we are so motivated to buy this property. We're going to put in a full 3% of purchase price as our earnest money deposit. If you have a buyer, they're writing an offer and the buyer only wants to put $1,000 and it's a multi-bid situation, as a listing agent, those buyers really went to the bottom of the pile when I presented the offer to the principal, because I would always put the most favorable offers on top, because then everything else was just downhill after that. And typically we'd counter back with just the ones that look serious. So you got to have a real conversation with your buyers of like, look, how serious are you? There's 15 other people that want this property. If you are serious about this, my recommendation is you put in 3% of the purchase price as your earnest money deposit. Now, of course, you get that back if you go through escrow and you find out you don't like the property or didn't pass your inspection. We'll cancel the contract before you remove all your contingencies. But it pretty much is that conversation you'll need to have. So in this case, we're going to put in, yeah, it's $1 million. So we're going to put in 3% of the purchase price. 3%, I'm sorry.
1.5%. Okay, now you're at 3%.
There we are. 3% of $1 million. So $30,000. And you're always going to template this to section 3A. You will never, ever, ever use 3A2. So you're always going to use 3A1. You're going to make the responsibility of the earnest money deposit that on the buyer to deliver to escrow by electronic funds, cashier's check, personal check, within 3 business days after acceptance. 3 business days after acceptance. So again, going back to the calendar, let's say we get accepted on the 13th. Well, day 1 is the 14th. So day 1, day 2, day 3, and in this case, 3 days falls on business days. So the deposit would be due on the 17th. You're never ever going to do 3A2. We do not trust log earnest money deposits. You'll always default to 3A1.
Yeah, never accept a check from a buyer for a deposit.
And Mark, you want to explain these little pop-ups?
Yeah, that one is related to 3D1 in the type of financing, and that sticky note has to do with, if you check the box that says FHA, there's a form that's called the acronym is HID, and the title of it is For Your Protection, Get a Home Inspection. That form is required in FHA transactions at the time the contract is signed, at the time the purchase contract is signed. So that's why that little sticky note is there, to remind you to include that if it's an FHA finance transaction, to include it with the offer. If it's not an FHA, if it's VA or something like that, you can just disregard that sticky note.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to delete it for now because it's in my
Yeah,
way.
that's fine. That's fine.
All right, increased deposit. In some cases, let's say we didn't do 3% up here. Let's say we did 1%. So that would be $10,000. You could do an increased deposit of an additional $10,000 or $20,000 to make it a full 3%. You can do it within a certain amount of days after acceptance or in a certain date. And of course, liquidated damages, when we get to that section, you'll never want to do more than 3% just to protect the buyer's money, even though liquidated damages is in effect.
The important thing in increased deposit is that, look, here's an example where this could be used. Let's say the buyer has 1% to put down as an EMD right now. And then in a week from now or 2 weeks from now, they have a CD that's maturing and they're going to use that money for an additional deposit. So, you could put an increased deposit in 2 weeks' time from the money they're getting from the CD that's maturing. So that would be a one way to use increased deposit. But the important thing to remember is the very last sentence in 3B, which is car form RID is needed at the time of the increased deposit, because it determines whether the additional increased amount is included or excluded from liquidated damages. So this section's not used that frequently, but if you do have an occasion to use it, you also have to look at that car form RID, which is the increased deposit form, and then determine, if you want to have it included or excluded from liquidated damages.
And this is probably only used about maybe less than 10% of the transaction.
Yeah, it's very rare, very infrequently used.
Yeah. Item C talks about if it's an all cash offer. All cash offer meaning no loan is needed and it's not contingent upon the buyer obtaining a loan. So this is going to be a loan. We're going to get that. And if it wasn't all cash, you can do the option of buyer shall, or within 3 days after acceptance, deliver seller such a verification. Otherwise, the verification is attached to the offer. So if you are doing all cash, here's what all cash is. All cash is money in the bank that someone can walk into the bank and ask for it to be withdrawn at a moment's notice. Cash is not a mutual fund, a stock account, a retirement account, money tied up in gold, money tied up in a property that needs to be sold. And a lot of people get that confused. So some people will think that when we talk about all cash, that you're going to send the verification, and cash is cash basically that they're going to be able to pull out of the bank at a moment's notice. If something has to be liquidated, you need to know how long the terms of the liquidation are. And then the next section is the loan amount. And this loan is going to be a conventional loan. So we're going to leave it blank. But if it was FHA, you would check this box. If it was VA, you would check this box. And in some cases, there's this little box right here that says seller financing, car form SFA. So seller financing is where the seller is going to finance part or all of the purchase All meaning because they own the property free and clear. Now, as a broker, if you ever do a seller financing contract, one, you need to reach out to me or Mark for guidance. And two, you're not really filling out the SFA because from a risk management level, we're not loan brokers and we don't really understand terms of a seller financing. So we have to direct the buyer and seller to deal with their own individual attorneys to craft a document if the seller is going to provide financing. And since we're not loan people, we can't be a part of that. A lot of risk involved in it. And then assumed financing would be this box right here. And assumed financing is where you're taking over the existing loan. So for example, VA loans are assumable loans. So that would be that box right there, or other, whatever other is. And this loan shall be at a fixed rate not to exceed. And this is where you're going to input what the buyer's pre-approval interest rate was plus a quarter point. So let's say their pre-approval was 3%. Now I don't know what rates are today, but let's say it's 3%. Well, we will go with the loan broker because we talked to the loan broker and the loan officer says, I asked the question, at what percentage rate would the buyer not qualify for the loan? Well, if the buyer was just barely scraping in and rates jumped up a whole half a point, the buyer would not be able to qualify. So use this as math. For every 1% increase in interest rates, for every 1% increase in interest rates, the buyer's purchasing power decreases by 10%. So 1% increase in interest rates, the buyer's purchasing power decreases by 10%. So if you have a $500,000 property that you're making an offer on and rates jump up a full point, and there's a 10% decrease in purchasing power, $500,000 purchase, 10% decrease in purchasing power, what is the loan amount there, the max they can get? Anybody want to put it in the chat bar? Paul is the smartest one in the room. Yes, 10% of 500 is 50,000. So their purchasing power now went down to 450,000. So keep that in mind because this is basically another contingency that would protect your buyer should rates jump up. And when we were going through COVID, rates were all over the place. And especially in a market we're in right now where, you know, the affordability for buyers is an all-time low. And a lot of the buyers that are coming in don't have a lot of reserves. So they're barely scraping in. And the rate that,
That's the adjustable rate area.
sorry.
If your buyer had an adjustable rate loan rather than conventional, like we're using in this example, there's a checkbox there that says, or an adjustable rate loan, and then you'd want to put that number in there. Try not to mix these numbers up. Like, you know, don't put the wrong, you know, don't indicate a rate in the adjustable rate if it's a conventional loan. That's confusing to the listing agent that you're sending it to. So make sure that you have that in the correct space, and that you do put something in the field where he just had entered 1%, the points. That could, you know, if there are no points, and again, this is a conversation with the buyer's lender, then you could put your cursor in that field and press the space bar, and you could type in the word none. I don't think it'll accept it if you just type in 0 in that field, but you can type in, if you type this, put your cursor in the field and then hit the space bar, you saw it change to that aqua color, and then that lets you free to form type whatever you want into that field. And it's better to fill in a field than to leave it blank if it's not applicable. So couple of, summarizing points here in 3D1. Make sure that you have all these terms in 3D1 and not part of them in 3D2, the second loan, because there is no second loan. The other thing that you're doing in completing 3D1 is you're establishing the parameters of the buyer's loan contingency. If you leave this section blank, you're essentially telling the seller, hey, my buyer will buy this for whatever price interest rates are and whatever points are. But if you fill this section in, you're establishing the cap on the buyer's loan contingency terms. Now, it could be countered out by the listing agent, but at least you're trying to establish this contingency for your buyer.
And most listing agents, good ones, will counter it out and say loan to be at prevailing rates. It's typically what they'll say.
And if you get that back from a listing agent, that prevailing rate clause, you could counter, if you want to issue a counter offer with, if that's the only thing you're countering, maybe you don't want to do that, but you could counter buyer to lock in rate and terms within 7 days. Something like that would be a little bit better than prevailing rate where it's just left wide open. But, that depends on the situation. If that's the only item that you would counter as a buyer, just to say to avoid prevailing rate, you may not want to do that counter offer. Your buyer may just want to accept and say, okay, let's just go with it. Rates are fairly stable. We'll just take a chance.
Robert,
Robert,
a question about what about hard money?
Yeah, I was going to ask you to see if you could address that.
So hard money, a lot of people think it's cash because the hard money lender will tell you, no, it's all cash, but it's not. It's not cash. Hard money is actually a loan because somebody's doing a loan and they're getting paid interest on it. So you could check the box other and put in hard money just to verify it.
I've also seen that in section 3E where additional financing terms where a clause was written. And sometimes this is like happens with a buyer who is an investor, is buying the property for an investment. The, buyer reserves the right to use hard money in section 3E, something like that, is possible. Again, it's not real common, but that's, if you're working with investor buyers, that may be something that you want to include.
So we're doing a $1 million property. We're going to put $30,000 down. We're going to do, the buyer, we're going to bring in 20% total of the purchase price. So 20% of $1 million is, anybody? 200,000. Okay. Paul's quick, but we've already put in 30,000, right? So the loan amount is going to be, anybody want to guess what the first loan amount is? Well, it's not going to be 800,000 because we've already brought in. See, if I put in 800,000, this is showing 170,000. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, because that would be the 20% down, the 30,000 and the 170, the EMD and the balance due at closing, and then the loan amount of 800.
I was trying to screw everybody up. But yeah, so we're doing an 80-20 loan, $800,000 loan. We put in 30,000. So this amount right here shows that the buyer is going to bring in the balance of another 170,000, plus of course the additional closing costs needed for the loan. Okay. Total purchase price, $1 million. Next section, verification of down payment and closing costs. Buyer shall within 3 days after acceptance deliver to seller written verification of buyer's down payment and closing costs or verification attached. So basically it's the buyer's pre-approval letter that you might as well just send this with the offer, because if you're trying to get your offers accepted, a listing agent and a seller is going to want to see this. So you get your pre-approval from your lender, just check that box and send it over. Appraisal. This agreement is or is not contingent upon a written appraisal of the property by a licensed certified appraiser. And the contingency period on this is going to be 17 days. So basically, every loan is going to require an appraisal, and this is a contingency to make sure that the property appraises. So once we get into escrow, the lender's going to order an appraisal, and the appraiser's going to go out and appraise the property. So this agreement will always be contingent upon a written appraisal. However, some lenders are attempting to say, will say sometimes that appraisal is not required. In other words, the loan will be guaranteed even if it doesn't appraise. But that again is a conversation to have with the lender to verify if you can really, really write an offer that's not contingent upon appraisal, even though they're getting a loan. So you need to make sure that you are able to do that before you check that box.
I think if the box in the previous page that says all cash offer is checked, it may disable that appraisal box. I'd have to check that programming to see if that's what it does. But if you were to check all cash offer on 3D, or is it 3A? I can't remember. Up a little bit more.
Yeah.
I believe it disables that appraisal field. So
Got it. You know what, Mark? I didn't cover the FHA VA loan.
yeah, it's pretty straightforward. If you check the box up above there, just scroll up a little, or there you go. If you check either one of those boxes, FHA or VA, it automatically adds another form into your transaction called the FVAC, the FVAC. And that basically is a document that explains that the buyer is using FHA or VA financing. And the seller has to agree with that because there may be some costs that a seller has to pay if a buyer is using FHA or VA financing. So this section D3 also mentions another form, FVA, which is kind of like the equivalent of the repair request for FHA and VA loans. You would use that FVA form if there was a lender requirement for a repair, like maybe termite or wood destroying pests repair. That would go on an FVA if you had an FHA or VA loan, rather than on the RR form, the repair request. And a buyer that's using FHA or VA financing can do both. They can put a lender required repair on the FA, and then they would ask for non-lender required repairs on the form RR.
So explain what most agents attempt to do in this market with termite work on an FHA or VA loan.
Yeah, we'll get to that in the next page, but there's a section there where it typically happens in 7A2, I think, where they'll put in, provide a termite report to the seller. They're asking this, provide a termite report and section 1 clearance. And that's really not the correct way to do it. It should be done on the FVA form. So,
in this section right here.
Yeah, the requests for wood destroying pest clearance in the RPA hasn't been in there for like 20 years, but agents talk to other agents and they say, oh, you have to put that request in the purchase contract. It's just an antiquated practice that's really hard to get people to understand. No, it goes on a repair request, because the reason behind it is that the cost of the repair is unknown. I mean, if you don't know how much something's going to cost to repair, or even if it needs to be repaired, well, how can you ask for someone to do it in advance? So it's just like any other repair, but we'll get into that a bit more as we go on.
So item H, I made a mistake when I said verification attached. I talk about the lender pre-approval. This is the down payment. So it's $1,000 that the buyer has that shows their down payment. Again, a down payment is cash. It can be mutual funds, retirement accounts, but it's something that are going to be able to liquidate in time, put in.
And proof of funds statement to like a bank account statement or a stock brokerage account statement. If you give your buyer's bank account statement as a proof of funds, you just give them the cover page and make sure that shows the balance in the account, and make sure that the account number is blacked out or redacted. You don't need to give that personal information, and you can just give the summary cover page that has the total amount. They don't need page 2, 3, 4 that shows where your buyer went to buy pizza or where they buy groceries or anything like that. So don't include all that extra information, just the proof that there is funds in an account, and then the account number should be blacked out or redacted.
And if you have a buyer that won't give you proof of funds, consider getting another buyer. Item I is the appraisal contingency and removal. I think we talked about that. So loan term, within 3 days, this says that the buyer is going to apply to a lender to get a loan, but we're going to always check letter attached, because we're going to attach it to our offers and send that with the purchase agreement over to the listing agent. And then loan contingency, buyer shall act in good faith to obtain the loans and move through the process of getting that done so they can close escrow on the property. Loan contingency removal. The contract is templated to 21 days after acceptance that the buyer needs to deliver to seller a loan contingency release or cancel the agreement. So basically it says the buyer's going to go into escrow. They're going to go through the process of applying for, the bank's going to go to work for underwriting them. And then you're going to get back from the lender, the loan's fully approved. And that'll be on the 21st day. But keep this in mind. The bank will say the loan's fully approved, we can move forward. They're not 100% approved. The bank could still pull back. So even though you're probably going to do a contingency release on the loan, just know that the full release of the lender contingency is not guaranteed that they'll get the loan. That has happened. Or item 4, no loan contingency. Again, you would check that box if there is no loan contingency.
And again, that might be pre-checked if you put all cash on the first page.
Lender limits on buyer credits. This has to do with the buyer. Let's say a buyer goes through and asks a seller for a certain amount of money towards closing costs, like $10,000. And the buyer limit is limited to the amount of credits they can get, not only from the seller, but also with the bank. And typically it's 6% of the purchase of the loan amount. So if you have a $500,000 loan, the max credits they can get is $30,000 off of a $500,000 loan.
I thought that was 3%, Robert.
I'm sorry. It is 3%, so $15,000. So check with the lender what the max is. So let's say a buyer gets $10,000 from the seller towards closing costs, and then a lender says, we'll throw in $8,000. Well, they're not going to get the full $18,000. They're only going to get up to 15, and the other 3,000 just goes away.
Yeah, you don't want to leave money on the table if you can avoid it.
Then buyer stated financing. This is the one overlooked portion of the contract that I school agents on a lot. Sellers relying on buyer's representation to the type of financing specified, including but not limited to, as applicable, all cash, amount of down payment, or contingent or non-contingent loan. Seller has agreed to a specific closing date, purchase price, and to sell the buyer in reliance on buyer's covenant concerning financing. Buyer shall pursue the financing specified in this agreement. Seller has no obligation to cooperate with buyer's efforts to obtain any financing other than that specified in the agreement, and the availability of any such alternate financing does not excuse buyer from the obligation to purchase the property and close escrow as specified in the agreement. So what this basically says is, buyer makes an offer on a property using ABC lender, and they're going to use conventional financing. And then midway, they decide to switch to FHA or VA. Basically says that the seller doesn't have to agree to that. You made the offer, you were going to do conventional financing with 20% down, and we're going to hold you to that, because conventional FHA and VA requirements have different lending standards. And maybe the seller has repairs that they have to pay for that the buyer can't pay for. Another case where it comes up is where a buyer will make all cash and then decide to switch to financing midstream. Well, the seller says, no, screw you. You said you're going to pay all cash. You're going to do all cash, and we're going to hold you to that. Otherwise, we don't have to agree, and we can cancel the agreement. That's what this contract stipulates right here. And many times this is discussed with agents on the other side as they attempt to change financing on a purchase agreement, and the seller says, no bueno. Mark, can you cover this section right here? I have to empty my bladder.
Sure. Section 4 addresses whether the seller, whether the buyer is selling another property in order to purchase this property. And so if that's the case, then you would use 4B, because the default is 4A, that's not contingent upon the sale of another property owned by the buyer. But if it is, then you check the box 4B. And again, the programming of ZIP form will add this new form into your transaction documents called the COP, contingency for sale of other property. And then that form needs to be completed in terms to describe the terms of how long the contingency is going to be given. And in this case, this is a little bit of a role reversal, because typically the buyer has contingencies for conditions. In this case, the seller is granting a contingency to the buyer. And that contingency, if granted, and if the COP form is signed, also needs to be removed within a certain time period. And if it's not, just like any contingency, the seller can give notice to the buyer to do so. And if they fail to do so, the seller can cancel. So that is a somewhat of a complicated, explanation, but the concept is pretty simple. If the buyer is selling another property and they have to sell it in order to buy this property, you want to use this COP form.
And this has happened where one of our buyer's agents got into escrow and they found out that the seller actually was in escrow on another property, and it was contingent upon that property selling, but they didn't incorporate the COP. So then it became a cluster. So
it's not
your buyer, hey, you don't happen to have a house you're in escrow on that you need to sell in order to be able to complete this purchase, do you? Just checking.
It's not sufficient just to make a mention of that the property needs to be sold, like in section 6, to type in something there. You have to have the form associated with it, because that defines the terms of the contingency.
Next section covers the addenda and advisories that are added to the agreement. Now, we have preloaded most of what is required in the transaction, being the BIA, the buyer's inspection, the statewide buyer seller advisory, the market conditions advisory, the affiliated business disclosure, the coronavirus addendum and or amendment, the CVA, the coronavirus property entry advisory and declaration, PED, and the SBSA to be delivered after acceptance. The reason why the SBSA says to be delivered after acceptance is because it's a 10-page document, and it's not necessary to send that over with all these other forms that got to go over. And then Mark occasionally finds that people will go through and, well, I'm not using Metro Escrow or Movement Mortgage, so I don't really need to use the affiliate business disclosure. That's not the intent behind it. The intent behind it, it's a disclosure that we're required by RESPA to disclose our affiliation to our buyers and sellers that we have an affiliate relationship with them. So you won't go through willy-nilly and start deleting some of these forms. They're there for a reason. Don't just delete because you feel like you can. Mark faces that, and you get schooled by Mark, and you don't want to be schooled by Mark.
Well, we don't want you to get a RESPA violation. That's why.
Mark has another sticky note.
See, the reason that that sticky note was placed there was because when the form was redesigned, they broke 7B across 2 pages, as you can see. And people would complete 7A, 1, 2, and 3, and then they'd miss 7B and go on to the next page and check the boxes in 7B2. So, you know, we had that sticky note there to remind you, but actually I see that we have it pre-checked now. And so, you know, so many people were missing it. We made the decision to pre-check seller. And so that was what that note was all about.
Mark, it didn't check.
Yeah, it's pre-checked as part of the global template. The B2.
These aren't pre-checked.
Yeah, those are not pre-checked by default, because here's why. It's up to, you know, it's an allocation of cost, and like, for example, what 7B2 relates to are homes that have water conservation fixtures or not. If you have making an offer on the home that is built after in or after 1994, you can check in 7B2 buyer is responsible, because all homes built after 1994 have water compliant fixtures. If it's built before 1994, then you as the buyer's agent may advise the buyer, why don't we ask the seller to pay for the cost of compliance? And then you check seller in 7B2I and II.
We're going to go to 7A1 first. Seller typically pays for the NHD, the Natural Hazard Zone Disclosure Report. And you can hit the drop-down bar right here, and it shows all the reports you can get. These are preloaded with zip forms. We're going to go with just my NHD. And then if there's any other reports that you want the seller to pay for, you would input the termite report.
Yeah, the clause that's used here a lot in 7A2 is termite inspection report by any licensed contractor, something like that. But this is the place where people typically will ask for Section 1 or Section 2 clearance, and you do not want to do that in this section.
No bueno. 7B, we did the retrofits already. That's already.
Well, 7B has to do with carbon monoxide and water heater bracing. So that one, it's customary for the seller to pay for those items. And so that's why we pre-check 7B1. But 7B2 is up to the buyer and seller, or may not be applicable to the property. Like I said, if it's built after 1994, you can just say buyer. If it's built before 1994, then you would check seller.
Chances are, if you're selling a home in Metro, it's going to be this. And Mark has another sticky note.
Yeah, this sticky note basically just as a reminder that, you know, you can define who you want the escrow company to be. And, you know, because A Plus Escrow is an affiliated business, it helps our brokerage if you make the selection of using them. That may be countered out by the listing agent because maybe they have a preferred company they want to use. So one important point here is, you see, there's a couple of choices in this pull down. Some of them are right, correct. Some of them are incorrect. 50-50 is okay. Each pay own is okay. 50-50 and each pay own is not okay, because which one is it? It's either 50-50 or each their own. You don't use both of those terms. The difference, or the point that you have to remember here, is that there's an imbalance between the buyer and the seller's costs. Okay, and if you choose 50-50, they split it down the middle. If you choose each their own, they pay their own respective costs, which might be, you know, it might be a 60-40 split or something like that.
So you always want to attempt to get A+ escrow if you can. Why not try and win it? Your escrow, your affiliates are there to help support your business.
Yeah,
But I would always select A+ escrow sellers,
may
and
not have
then
that.
the agent can either counter that out or confirm which escrow they want to use. Title, typically, seller pays for the title and policy. And I'm a lawyer's fan. That's who I use. That's why it's in my, this is my template. So I'll do lawyer's title or seller's choice. These things that are missed, I can tell you there's been multiple times where agents have sent an offer over and they never check that box. And then it becomes a discrepancy about who's going to pay. Because a title policy would be, you know, it's in the like $1,500, $2,000 range. And if you've made the mistake by not checking this box, guess who they're coming after? They're coming after your commission because you didn't fill out the contract properly. And then all of a sudden that $10,000 commission went down to $8,500 because you had to buy a title policy for your buyer. Because the seller says, I'm not paying it. That's not what we agreed to. And the buyer says, well, we wanted you to, but my agent didn't check the box. And then the buyer looks at you, says, hey, Mr. Agent, you're going to pay for my title policy because you're the one that filled out the contract for us. So just make sure that these boxes are checked. And you review it multiple times, because I can't tell you how many times I've missed some boxes that I checked and sent it over. And then it's always a good habit. Now, Zip Form's pretty good now, but occasionally go through and hit the save button so you can save all your work. In the past, Zip Forms used to just, you go through, fill out a contract, and we completely just blank out and lose everything. They've gotten a lot better for a while. Other costs, typically the seller will pay the county transfer fee. And then typically a seller will pay a city transfer tax or fee, but you need to know the city that you're writing in and if there is a transfer tax. Now, in the city of San Diego, there is not a transfer tax. But as a best practice for me, Mark might disagree with me on this, but for me, I just always check that box for seller, just in case. It's just my habit to make sure that the seller pays any city transfer tax, even though there isn't one in the city of San Diego.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. You know, the only other thing I'd add is in the extra space there beside where it says fee, just type the words if applicable. And if you do that, if it's applicable, then they're saying that the seller would pay. If it's not applicable, then it doesn't require a counteroffer to remove it.
Next section is the HOA transfer fee. Typically, the seller will pay that fee. And then the seller typically will pay for HOA fees for preparing documents required by Civil Code 4525. There's a very specific set of documents that the seller is responsible for by law. Basically, that's what a Civil Code is, that they have to pay for to deliver to the buyer. So that's what Section 4 covers. And then there's other documents that cost to prepare the documents that the HOA fee, that the HOA company will assess. You always want to pay, typically the seller will pay all those fees.
This is why you don't see a checkbox on item D4, because it's required that the seller pay that by the Civil Code. That's why there's not an option for the buyer or seller to pay it. It's predefined that the seller has to pay.
And then section 7 is any private transfer fee. So a private transfer fee is found on the title report if there is one. An example of this would be in a high-rise building downtown San Diego that when they were built, there's like a 10-year moratorium that if anybody was to buy in a brand new high-rise and then they attempted to sell within a 10-year period, the developer would recoup part of that cost by doing a transfer fee of 1% of that sale price. So it's like a residual income for the builder on that building. So you need to know if there's a transfer fee. Typically it's high rises downtown San Diego. You would find that in the title report if there is one. So make sure if you're writing an offer on a high rise in downtown San Diego, ask the listing agent. And again, most agents don't know about this. So you might have to do your own research to make sure there's no transfer fee. And then 8 and 9, if there's any other costs that you want the seller to incur, you would put that in here. Item 10, typically the seller will pay for a home warranty. Now you need to know the cost of a home warranty and what plan you're going to get. So you need to get the brochure from the home warranty companies. We recommend Old Republic. They're one of the best home warranty companies. And we also recommend, because Old Republic will also represent our E&O carrier, they have a policy from CRES, C-R-E-S, that they'll convert you into. And utilizing CRES as a home warranty, you'll be able to reduce Mark, what's the word?
Deductible.
The deductible in case there's ever a claim and we're out $10,000. So know the cost of the plan. For this place, I'm going to put $550, and I'm always going to check the upgraded plan. And there is an air conditioner on this property, so I want to make sure there's an air conditioner. There's no pool, no spa, because it's an HOA. And always remember, if you don't name the plan and check upgraded, and let's say you don't name it and you just put in $550, well, the seller is not obligated to give you an upgraded plan or any plan with Old Republic. They can choose whatever plan they want. So naming the plan guarantees what plan you get with that seller. Otherwise, they're only required to give you the basics.
And this is a negotiable item too, by the way, and you might get a counter offer back from a seller that says that the seller will pay up to, $400. And if the buyer wants the coverage greater than that, it's at buyer's cost. So you can ask for it and you may get it, or you may get a counter offer that says they'll pay something less and the buyer can upgrade it if they wish.
And then here, some people are waiving the buyer getting the home warranty. They check that box, but it doesn't preclude a buyer from purchasing it themselves. If they want to, you can buy a home warranty even if after they close escrow, the buyer can. They've been in the house a couple of years, they can buy a home warranty. Home warranty is an insurance company. They'll sell anything to anybody, anytime, anywhere. They just want your money.
If you're representing an investor buyer, typically the waiver box is used because they're going to probably do extensive renovations to a property and they don't really care about the home warranty. So investor buyer, generally the waiver is checked. But it's a question to ask the buyer.
On a flip property, we highly recommend a home warranty with expanded coverage, the upgraded, because you never know on a flip property if there's some issues within the walls, like plumbing, old pipes. And those plans can cover stuff like that. All right, we are at our time. We're going to stop at section 8 today. We appreciate your participation today. Does anybody have any questions you want to put in the chat box? I see we've been doing all that, answering those questions. I want to make a pitch. Everybody needs to show up for our team meeting tomorrow. It's stats with Ashley, but I'm going to be having a conversation about COVID and what the industry and you guys can do to help make sure that we stay open And it's very important that you're on this call because I'm starting to have conversations with everybody because I don't want to end up in another shutdown. None of us do. And I'll be relaying information from a statewide call that we have with the California Association of Realtors and all the brokers across the state about what we are all doing to make sure that we stay open. So hopefully you are all there to participate. And with that said, we are done for the day. It's great seeing so many great faces on here. Hope you guys learned something. It will be section 2 starting on part 8 this Thursday starting at 2 o'clock. And we'll get through the entire session. We'll make sure we stay on time the next time to finish through and go through the entire rest of the purchase agreement. With that said, you all have a great day and chat later.